So, Mandy, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Can we start with a little bit about your story? Like, why is it this is the work you do, especially focused on sexual freedom, human rights? Like, what's made this your passion?
Yeah, so it all started in undergrad. I was a peer sex educator on my college campus. We had a really cool program called Project Shape, which stood for Sexual Health and Peer Education. And I had a fabulous mentor. Her name was Dr. Carol Stanger, one of my idols. And she had built Project Shape like really from the ground up. I went to the University at Albany, and part of the program was you actually took a course. It was a full semester long that she taught all about sex ed and sexual health and, like the basics, but far more than I got in high school.
Yeah.
Um, which is not saying much living in the United States, but and she prepared us to do all of these different programs and all these different educational activities on the college campus. And I really just fell in love, like head over heels
Mm.
in love with this program. And so I started my freshman year and I spent all 4 years in Project Shape. And when it came time to come for graduation, I was like, well, what am I going to do? Right?
Yep,
Sex
right. Wah.
educator. Right. Like sex educator's not on like the aptitude test, right? When you're trying to figure out what your career is going to be. And um, Dr. Stenger had told me about a program at Widener, which is a dual degree program in social work and human sexuality. And she was like, you can do this program and you could go into sex therapy, or, you'll have like this clinical degree and this will really, create some options for you.
Hmm.
Um, and so I went to Widener, and what actually ended up happening is I fell in love again with social work.
Ah.
And the social work code of ethics is just like one of the most beautiful documents ever written, in my opinion.
Mm.
And it talks all about social justice and meeting people where they are and service, and all of those things really appealed to me. And yet I still had this interest in sexuality and sex ed specifically. And it was at that time, one of my fellow students was a volunteer with the Woodhull Freedom Foundation. And we used to run a conference called the Sexual Freedom Summit. It was a 4-day event where people would come together from sort of like all walks of life. You had activists, you had sex therapists, you had educators, you had people who were just like generally interested, as well as folks from like the swinger lifestyle or kinky folks, people who just engaged in this in their free time. And I started volunteering for the summit. I loved that it blended sexuality and policy and activism.
Hmm.
And that was really it for me. It was like I found this place and I volunteered for years and years and years. But I was working, I was getting my master's, then I was working full time as a social worker. I have a background in geriatric social work. That was my day job. Um, and then there was a point in time where I was moving and I was going to be out of a job, and Woodhull happened to have an open position. And, it was sort of like the stars just aligned, and this organization that had always been a passion project for me wound up being a full-time position. And so
Yeah.
I was a volunteer actually for about a decade before I even worked at Woodhull. So it's kind of an interesting, kind of convoluted path to where I am, as I think is the case with a lot of people who work in this field.
Convoluted, maybe, but it also opened in front of you. I mean, it had little twists and turns, but it definitely had a direction to it from very early on.
Yeah, for sure. There are definitely parts of this job and more so just this work in general that very much feel like a calling,
Hmm.
um, which is important for me. I think particularly in the year 2025 when there's a lot of scary stuff happening in this country, it feels um, difficult to do this work, but it also feels really important. And it's nice to like go to my 9 to 5 and feel like I'm actually kind of contributing to some good in the world.
Right, right. All right, I have a question that I'll just spring on you, and I'm not even sure I
Sure.
can fully form it. But back in college, when you were doing this peer support,
hmm
can you think of any? stories or examples of the kinds of challenges and lack of freedom and information that people had that you were starting to interact with that formed your interest in fighting for these rights now?
Yeah, it was, honestly, it was like a general lack of information. So we had one of our programs was called um, Sex Ed Jeopardy. And it was just like a Jeopardy game, right? We had the board, it was like the whole thing. Um, and we would ask lots of questions about like there was like an STI category, there was a contraception category, all of this stuff. And I just remember, I mean, one, learning it myself in the course, having my mind blown, being like, I didn't know most of this information.
Yeah.
And then doing it with students, and we would do these programs several times a semester, all over our campus. My school was huge. We had 18,000 undergrad. So we were doing this all of the time, and it was amazing to me. There was never a time when we ran this program where people were like, "Yeah, I knew that." Oh, I didn't learn anything. People were always really amazed. But the other thing is people were excited, like the permission that they felt to be able to be curious and
Mm.
learn about sexual health, about sexuality, be able to ask questions that they maybe didn't have a forum to ask questions for before, was really amazing. And I think that that's the part that was so inspiring to me is I felt like people were letting me into their lives a little bit,
Hmm.
and I was also all of us, not just me, all of us that were a part of Project Shape were giving them permission to be curious, ask questions without shame, right?
Yeah, and
Like
to
there was no
admit that they
judgment.
don't know, right? You can't even
Yeah.
be open to information if you can't admit, wait, there's stuff I don't know.
Right, exactly. And it was fun. That's the other thing is like the little bit of sex that I remember having in high school was like seeing pictures of like genital warts. And it was like fear-based. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Of like,
Yeah.
if you have sex, this is what, your body is going to look like. And isn't that terrible? And I remember, I have a very actually distinct memory of being in like, I don't know, ninth grade health class and all of us being in these groups and looking at these things and the classroom was like silent
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
all of us were like what's happening here? This is really scary. This feels like a horror movie. And that is the exact opposite experience of what I was having when I was doing this on campus. And I think that's the feeling, that's the atmosphere I'm always chasing,
Right.
um, and it was sex ed then. Now it's just like broader bodily autonomy and sexual freedom rights. But I'm always looking for ways to give people permission to be curious, to seek pleasure, to ask questions. That's what really interests me. I'm also realizing that I think I totally veered off your question, but I hope
That's
I sort of
okay.
got to the point.
Yeah. 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 So how do you define sexual freedom? I mean, information must be a baseline
Yeah.
for that, like a starting point, but what else is involved in sexual freedom?
Yeah. So the beautiful thing about sexual freedom, and this is my favorite party trick when I go to like a cocktail party for Woodhull or an event or whatever, people are like, what is sexual freedom? And I'm always like, well, I don't know. What do you think sexual freedom is? Because I think it's different for every single person. But the way I define it and the way we talk about it in our work at Woodhull is basic bodily autonomy.
Hmm.
So I, as an adult, can choose to do with my body what I want to do with it and also what I do not want to do with it, right? So
Mm.
it's just as much about being able to say yes to things as it is about being able to say no to things. Some of the things I think are sort of under the sexual freedom umbrella are reproductive choice. Um, I think making decisions about our bodies that don't actually have anything to do with our reproductive health, things like gender expression, gender identity. I think all of that falls under the sexual freedom umbrella.
Hmm.
We at Woodhull talk about free speech all of the time and just being able to talk about sexual freedom topics, right? And that can range anything from sex ed, like we've been talking about a lot in this discussion, to just being able to talk about sex or pleasure or sex toys or, I mean, even say the word sex and spell it correctly on social media.
Right.
To me, I never thought that would be a part of my sexual freedom advocacy. But, here in the year 2025, when social media loves a shadow ban, that's
Yeah.
also become a part of it.
Isn't that wild that like sex is a dirty word somehow?
Yes, and it's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah.
And the fact that I don't know if you've heard of it, but there's a website called the Algospeak Dictionary, ALGO Speak,
Huh. Okay.
and it's all different words, not just related to sex, right? Because it's not just sexual speech that is a victim of this on social
Right.
media. It's why we have the term like unalive, right? As opposed to kill. Can't say
Hmm.
kill on TikTok or Instagram. You have to say unalive. Which is the first time I heard that, I was like, what? Like, it's just, it's wild to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and a little bit infuriating, I think, particularly if you're somebody who is trying to destigmatize and educate. Like, what are we telling people? That it's not okay to say the word sex?
Right. Or a body part. I mean, which is,
Yeah.
you know, yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes I watch something and I'm like, I have no idea what this person is talking about just because they're trying to get by the censors
Right.
by mispronouncing and misspelling things. And it just creates a lot of confusion and
Yeah.
misunderstanding.
Yeah. And adds to the sense of taboo and dirtiness or shame around this stuff if we can't talk about it
Yeah.
openly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So in my head, I'm wondering about, I think I have certain ideas, or people might have certain ideas that, oh, the rest of the world struggles with sexual freedom, or we've got genital mutilation practices in country. I mean, like there's a stuff we might have in our mind that, oh, third world countries have this problem versus what's happening in the U.S. Or um,
Yeah.
can you speak to is there any dichotomy there? Is it the same work across the world? I don't know if Woodhull is working, across the entire country
Yeah.
or the whole world, but
Our work is focused in the United States,
okay.
but we certainly collaborate with people from all over the world. Sexual freedom and sexuality does have a cultural element to it, right? The way that I learned about my body, learned about sexuality, was socialized around sexuality and shame and all of these things is a uniquely American experience because this is where I grew up,
Hmm.
right? Somebody who grew up in a different place is probably going to have different values. I remember in my course at Project Shape learning a lot about what happens in the Netherlands around sex education and it being really comprehensive in high school. And I think it was, don't quote me, but I also think it was France that makes the birth control pill and other contraception really readily available, but also bundled with sex education when you get it as a teenager. And I remember learning that and being like, mind blown.
Yeah.
Like that
Yeah.
would never happen in the United States. And there are certain cultural practices outside of the US that we would look at and be like, wow, that's a huge violation of our sexual freedom rights. You brought up genital mutilation. And I have somebody who emails me quite frequently at Woodhull, and he lives here in the United States, and he is against genital mutilation for men, which he feels like circumcision of the penis is
Right.
also
Right.
genital mutilation. So, some of the ways in which we contextualize these issues is very different.
Yeah.
Um, but the general idea of the bodily autonomy piece and getting to make your own decisions about bodily autonomy we feel is pretty universal.
Hmm.
I mean, there's an issue that I don't think gets a lot of attention sort of in the mainstream press, something that's been happening for decades, and that's the what happens to intersex children when they're born in this country, right? Where a
Yeah. Yeah.
doctor sort of makes a decision about um, what gender a particular child is going to be. I personally think that's a huge violation of bodily autonomy and sexual freedom rights. And that's happening here in the United States and has been happening for decades. So,
Yeah.
the United States in general likes to kind of um, feel superior to
Right.
other
Right. We don't
nations.
have problems to solve. Yeah.
Right, right. And what I find is that is very often not the case. And it's not to say that other nations don't have their issues. It's just to say that we have our issues too. We're just, I think, good at not talking about them or being like, oh, we can't talk about that here, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not for polite conversation.
Yeah. So, what are some of the policies or laws or focuses of your foundation right now in terms of expanding human rights and sexual freedom?
Well, I got to say we've been quite busy.
Yeah, I bet.
We yeah, so Woodhull's been around for 23 years. We were founded in 2003, and our belief is that sexual freedom is a human right. So all of
Hmm.
our work is nonpartisan in nature, and we're always talking about sexual freedom from a human rights perspective. Um, we want to take party out of it. We want to talk about the humanity of it all. And what that has looked like over the past year, or well, several years, has been really interesting.
Hmm.
We've submitted testimony or letters of opposition or support in 11 different states in 2025 already. Um, just recently, it was submitting written testimony against South Carolina's really extreme proposed abortion ban. It's a really, really ugly piece of legislation. If you just Google South Carolina abortion ban, it'll all come up. Testimony was just about a week ago. We've also submitted testimony in Colorado against their trans bathroom ban. So that's been something that's been popping up all over the place. And then we've been really involved in opposing age verification legislation, which I think is a little, people might be like, why does Woodhull care about that? But
Yeah,
for
yeah,
folks who don't know, I think 20 states at this point in the United States have passed an age verification law. What this means is if you live in a state with one of these laws on the books, and Louisiana was the very first to pass one of these laws in 2022, what it says essentially, they all vary a little bit, but the main points are basically the same. And what it says is that if you are a website that has 33.3% or more adult content on your platform, which let's just start there, hard to sort of figure that out
right, right,
sometimes, but most often we think that these are targeting explicit websites that have pornography on them.
right.
So, what these laws say is if you meet that requirement, you have to age verify your users. So, what that means is if I'm in Louisiana and I want to go on a pornographic website, for example, and I'm an adult, when I log onto the website, I'm going to see a box that says you have to submit your identification before we're going to let you on this website. So, that means having to put in your license information. In some states, it's actually a biometric face scan where AI is going to decide if you look like you're over 18, which is it's a little too sci-fi scary for me
Yeah, yeah,
personally. And, people are like, why are you against that? Like kids shouldn't be accessing pornography. Yes, 100%. Here's the problem. I have a human right to privacy. I have a
yeah.
human right to
And
access information anonymously online. These laws are a direct violation of that. And
yeah,
so
because
we've
they
been
could be
really
keeping a
involved.
registry of everybody, visiting a porn site or something.
Exactly. And we've talked so much about shame here. And I think, accessing porn online from the privacy of your own home is a relatively harmless way to explore your sexual identity. Right. Now, I'm not talking about things that are already illegal. I'm not talking about
Right.
content like child sexual abuse material. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about here is adults who are 18 and up, who are in their own homes, logging onto their computers to look at pornography. We don't feel that you should be surveilled when you're trying to do that, nor should that information be kept anywhere. And a lot of the laws have language in them that says something like platforms should not retain any of this data. Here's the problem. The technology doesn't exist to follow that requirement. And we've seen examples of numerous hacks of information where people thought that their data was protected. They thought that they were anonymous and they weren't, right? I think Ashley
Ashley
Madison's,
Madison comes to mind, right?
yeah, that was a huge one. If folks aren't familiar, there's a really good documentary on Netflix all about that. But just recently, a couple months ago, there was an app called the Tea app. I don't know if you've ever heard of
I
this.
haven't heard that one.
So it's tea like a cup of tea, TEA. And the idea was the app was created for primarily women who had had a bad experience with an ex-lover, ex-boyfriend, or whatever. Say, he cheated or he was abusive, whatever the case was. This was a place where you could go on and share the tea about this
Spill the
person.
tea, right? Stay
Right,
away from Bob, right? Yeah.
right. To sort of warn other women, right? We know that it's unsafe to essentially date men. I know that's a blanket statement, but the data kind of backs me up on that one. And so this was an app where women could share that kind of information. Well, there was a big hack over the summer, and thousands of users' information was leaked online. Now, you
Wow.
can imagine how exceedingly dangerous this kind of leak was, particularly if you were dealing with an abusive individual, an individual who maybe was like stalking, all of that stuff. And all this information was just out there. It was leaked on 4chan, which is a very scary, terrible corner of the internet to begin with. So we've just seen so many examples of this kind of technology being really, really harmful to
Hmm.
people. And that's why Woodhull's been so active in opposing it.
Yeah. And are you pretty active around like the intersex children topic, or is that something that isn't as present right now? I mean, in terms of urgency.
Yeah, it's one of those things where we're always monitoring these kind of bills, and we haven't seen a lot of it specific to the intersex community come up in legislation. But where we have seen a lot of this discussion come up is when we're seeing gender affirming care bans. We've
Hmm.
seen the intersex community doing a lot of testifying and a lot of educating that, frankly, they should not have to do of our
Right.
lawmakers to say, hey, your gender affirming care ban is not only terrible, period, it also is incredibly inaccurate and totally invalidates my existence.
Right. Right.
I'm not a trans person. I'm an intersex person. I'm paraphrasing here. Um, and this ban is incredibly problematic. And so we've seen a lot of that there, and we've been pretty active in opposing those bans, where we see them.
Yeah. So, how could I or any individual person listening to this who's maybe feeling a little inspired or motivated get involved in some way to
Yeah.
promote sexual freedom?
So right now, we've got a lot of nonsense happening at the federal level in the United States. And a lot of that feels very big and very scary and very intimidating. And so my advice to people has been pick an issue that you're really passionate about, right? There's a lot of things I'm passionate about, but think about what is like maybe your top one or top two. And then Google, let's just pick abortion access. Google abortion access and your town, and you're going to get a list of organizations working on that issue. They 99.9% of these folks are going to have a newsletter or a social media presence or a sign up if you want to help us. And if you have time or talent to give, it's a really good way to get involved. Everybody has the talent. My talent, I'm an excellent spreadsheet maker. So I'm really passionate about libraries and access to literacy. So here in Brooklyn, I just joined a group called the New York City Public Library Advocacy Network. And one of my first jobs for them is like, they were like, we need to figure out who on the city council supports libraries. So my job was to look at a spreadsheet of all our city council members and Google if they've made any public statements about libraries or whatever and record that information. Now, am I changing the world with this task? No, but I'm benefiting a local community organization who's trying to change things in my neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so I really encourage people to pick an issue and do that. If you don't have time to give, but you might have money to spare, donating to your local organizations is really crucial. One of the things the Trump administration has been really diligent about over the last few months is attacking nonprofits and 501c3 organizations, particularly organizations that don't align with their values. And so if there's something you're really passionate about, donating to one of those organizations is incredibly beneficial, particularly if you can become a monthly donor. If you can $10 a month, that's cheaper than a Netflix subscription at this point. And if you can contribute to a local nonprofit, that's a really big deal. And, if you don't want to go local, Woodhull would be more than happy to receive those donations as well. Just supporting folks and asking how you can be the most helpful about an issue you can care about, I think is the best advice I have for folks.
Yeah. All right. So let's finish up with how do people find Woodhull? Where do they go? What's their first step if they do want to connect with
Yeah.
you or the organization?
Yeah, so our website is woodhullfoundation.org. We're spelled Woodhull. We're named after Victoria Woodhull, who, if you're looking for some inspiration, do a quick Google. First woman to ever run for president in 1870,
Mm,
first woman to have a brokerage on Wall Street. She's a free lover. So we're very inspired by her work. But you can head on over to woodhullfoundation.org. Our website is a wealth of information. You can read all of the letters that we've sent over the past year. We have a blog, we have a newsletter, we have something called Fact Check by Woodhull, where we are researching common myths about sexual freedom. So, also, listen, if you're out there and you're a keyboard warrior and you're engaging in the Facebook fights with folks who don't agree with sexual freedom, we've got a resource for you, and it's Fact Check by Woodhull. You can just link right to it, and you can just be like, "Hey, Uncle Larry, that anti-trans thing you said, no, thank you. Here, go, go get educated." Everything on our website is free. We have a YouTube page as well. It's called Woodhull Freedom. Just Google that on YouTube. All of our programs are on our website. They also all have ASL interpretation. We want things to be as accessible for people as possible. So that would be a great way to find our work. And if you have questions, or also I always tell people, Woodhull is not everywhere. So if there is an issue going on in your community where you feel like you need some support or some
mm.
guidance, or you'd like us to send a letter to your local government about something, please reach out. My email is Mandy, Mandy, at woodhullfoundation.org. We want to be a resource. So those would be the first few ways that folks can engage with us.
That's wonderful. That's some really good leads or directions for people to go. So, thank you again for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you so much for having me. I love talking about this stuff, so I'm really glad to be able to chat with you.